All right, it's great to have you on today, Chris. So just some context on Chris and who he is. Chris is the co-founder and president of Convictional, which is the #1 modern dropshipping platform for retailers and suppliers. And Convictional is backed by Y-Combinator and was one of the top 10 startups that pitched on demo day for its batch, which is super cool. But before Chris became the entrepreneur he is today, he was a Queen student studying commerce. So super curious to hear more about your story today, Chris.
Thanks, James. Really appreciate you having me on your podcast. And as we were saying before we hit record, I love hearing from students who are creating things, whether it's a podcast, a blog, a piece of content, or their own startup. And so, just hats off to you, and just thrilled to be here.
Appreciate that, Chris. So why don't we dive into things here? So why don't you start by maybe giving us the founding story of how you and your co-founders came to start Convictional, but maybe even just before that, what is Convictional? Tell us what you guys do there.
For sure. So, Convictional helps retailers onboard and integrate third-party vendors, so they don't have to hold inventory and they can expand their online assortment. So we started the company after my co-founder and I met at Shopify. We started the company after we left Shopify, but we were really interested in this idea of connecting buyers and sellers together. So brands selling to retailers via wholesale or in a dropship model. And at the time, when we were at Shopify, dropship was a legitimate business strategy for retailers who had, 8, 9 figure IT budgets to throw at legacy systems or to build these tools themselves. And then, sort of at the bottom of the market, you had sort of people selling ebooks on how to get rich and buy Lambos by doing FBA or dropship by selling products from AliExpress. And so there really wasn't anything in the middle, right? So a great piece of software that could enable fast growing businesses to onboard products and brands without holding inventory and make it super, super seamless for both sides of the transaction. And so we left our jobs, started the company. And since then, Convictional is used by thousands of businesses. We have a growing network of vendors and retailers, both startups and publicly traded companies. And we're really #1 as far as modern dropship platforms go. And we're continuing to evolve that and expand into new markets.
So how did this, obviously you said you're working at Shopify, that's how you kind of learned about this ecosystem, but maybe how did you find your co-founder and what really put you on this trajectory to start this thing?
Yeah. So, I remember when I joined Shopify, it was my first full-time job out of Queens. First, maybe just even like backing up a little bit, how did I end up at Shopify? They had just gone public, but before that, I think, going into your third year at Queens Commerce, on-campus recruiting is, the thing you need to participate in as soon as you step foot on campus at the start of September. And there's all of these firms chasing, interns for the coming summer. And so there's only a handful of positions across the main avenues, as you know, being a fourth year. There's consulting and banking and accounting and CPG marketing. And, you know, you have to do a lot of prep to put yourself in the best position possible to get those jobs. I did not have good grades in my first year. And I thought that at the time, consulting was the most interesting of those major paths. Sales, by the way, was just not prominent whatsoever. Startups weren't really a thing on campus or even a legitimate option at the time. And so, of the main options, consulting seemed like the one that would be most appealing to me. And so, I had to overcome the hurdle of like not having had great grades in first year. I just didn't know how to study, didn't really commit myself academically, and was focused on actually like other side projects and stuff. Um, and so I remember cold emailing the global managing director of McKinsey, Dominic Barton, and basically read this report that he had published alongside some other peers of his at McKinsey. And I remember writing a pretty lengthy cold email to him that had demonstrated that I read it and understood the points that he was communicating in this report, and pitched myself as a candidate to join McKinsey. And I was expecting, no one's going to read this. Like, he's going to come of this. And I actually received an email from the head of recruiting, who basically said, "Thank you for your note. It was forwarded around and we want to interview you." And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So don't underestimate the power of cold email. I think you have to aim it in the right direction, as you'll soon find out. I did the interview with McKinsey and got absolutely crushed by the mental math and the on the fly guided case style interview. I did quite a bit of prep in the summer before to, again, maximize the chances that I would get hired. But it all came apart in the interview. And I think that rejection, that failure led me to do a little bit of soul searching. Was I applying for these consulting jobs because I felt like I had to, and it seemed like the only path that was presented in front of me? Or was I actually, interested in something else? And I walked away from that on campus recruiting season with no jobs, no consulting jobs. My friends were already hired at best investment banks, best firms, and they had written their ticket and they're getting ready to do their exchange in that year. And I was basically unsure if I even wanted to do an exchange, let alone could I afford it. And I didn't have any job prospects. So things really changed though when I started thinking about joining startups. So my parents are small business owners, kind of come from a family of entrepreneurs. And I sort of, after that soul searching process of being rejected by McKinsey, realized that like I was only applying for that job because it was coveted, because of the environment I was in, not because I was thinking from first principles about what I actually wanted to do. What I actually wanted to do was build companies. I wanted to build generational wealth for myself. I wanted to control my time, build products, get customers, and sort of learn, put myself in the best position possible to maximize the surface area of learning. And so I read a book, Influence by Robert Cialdini, which covers basic principles of influence, very applicable even to this day in sales, even though the book was published in I think like the 70s or something. Took Jim Hamilton's class. And through Jim Hamilton's class, one of the guest speakers worked as an account executive at this large enterprise tech company called Cisco Systems. So after class, I approached this person. He gave me his email. I then followed up via email, had a couple of calls with him. He put me in touch with some other people at Cisco. And then lo and behold, a job opportunity opened for that summer. And so this is I want to say, I think this is like March or April. So really down to the end of the year without a job. And I needed to work, had student loans, and I got hired. I got the job at Cisco. Just literally hustled my way in. I made so many connections and had them all vouch for me, and obviously prepared for the interview. And that was a fantastic experience. It was sales. It was being in sort of an open office surrounded by people who were calling on the phone, doing meetings. And I was just like sitting there listening to all of them. As that summer progressed, this thought came to my mind, which was that like I wanted to be on the right side of the economic equation for revenue, meaning, salespeople bring in revenue, but they only take home a small percentage of what they bring in. Whereas if you own the company and you bring in revenue, you're increasing the value of your stock, of your business. And if you have a sizable portion of stock in that business and you're bringing in revenue, you just are on the best side of the economic equation. While you may not have commission if you're, a founder who's not paying yourself dividends or commission or things like that, you're increasing the value of your stock, and that could be worth someday. And so, I think that summer at Cisco just really exposed my perception of what is actually possible for my career and my journey. And then, I joined Shopify coming into the next year. They were just starting a sales office in Waterloo. It seemed like a great opportunity to, again, get in on the ground floor and learn a lot more about what it takes to actually find product market fit for a company that is, obviously very well established, but was starting a new line of business altogether. So that's just sort of how I ended up at Shopify, and I'm happy to dig into any of that as relevant.
Yeah, that's a super interesting internship experience and previous experience before entering the real world, I guess. It is interesting you say that though, because I took the sales course last semester with Jim Hamilton, phenomenal course, recommended to any Queen students out there. But that isn't a skill students are maybe looking to build right out of university, or a career path that more students don't go into. It is typically the consulting or banking track. Um, but the next question I want to ask you was, so you were working at Shopify. Um, you said you had a great experience there, but you had this calling for the startup world and starting your own business. So how can someone develop the conviction to leave their full-time job to start a company?
For sure. Um, I think the answer to this question is really individualized, and I'll give you what I needed, and then maybe some general recommendation for folks. So I had student loans. My parents weren't, paying my bills. Um, didn't really come from a family of lots of money, and that's all good. But it meant that I needed to have some amount of financial runway in order to leave and start a company. And so I think that the most important thing for any entrepreneur is, do you have financial runway to sustain yourself while you're getting your business going? And I think that looks different for everybody, of course. For me, the number that I felt comfortable with in terms of leaving my full time job to go full time on a startup of my own was 24 months of runway. 2 years, I felt I would either develop something that could pay the bills in 2 years, raise money if it were going to be sort of venture scale, or at least raise a seed round, um, or I would fail and I'd have to go back to getting a job, which wouldn't be the worst outcome because I would be probably a lot smarter and more effective and better having just spent 2 years of my life grinding on a startup. And so if that were the path, it would basically be like an MBA. So that was my decision. So long as I had that 24 months of runway, I felt like I was going to commit to doing this. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'd spent some time in university doing side projects. For me, side projects were always hard to commit myself to, because there was always classes, there were like clubs on campus, there were friends. I had a pretty great social life, and I think that that advice, so leaving your full-time job to do a startup was essential for me to actually activate and get going on it. For others, they could, do it while they have their full-time job. They could, maybe they don't want to start something that's venture scale. Maybe they want to just, I don't know, create YouTube videos, or write content, or start an e-commerce business. Like, some of these things you're actually able to do and do quite successfully over a longish period of time, in evenings and weekends. And so if you can do that and you have the discipline and you can time manage your full-time job, your 9 to 5, while building that, side business, do that, right? You don't need to quit full-time. But for me, in order to allocate the energy and focus necessary, that's what I needed to do. And then I needed to, of course, give myself the financial runway to make it happen. While you're saving money, there are some things you could be doing as well to gain even more conviction in your ability to succeed. Um, and you're not going to know if you're going to be successful, right? Like, there's no guarantee of any of these things, but you want to increase the likelihood that the thing is going to be successful. And so some skills that at the time were very relevant, I'd argue are still relevant to this day, are, either learning how to code or learning how to sell. Um, and so, students, I think at Queens and other places, underestimate the importance of those two skills in starting a company. Learning to code is really relevant for, both tech companies and non-tech companies, I would say, but learning to sell is really applicable to any business. And so I think, students are like, okay, it must be easy. I took Jim Hamilton's class. I got an A or A plus. Like, what could be so hard about it? The number of students who've left their jobs to start something and then email me and say, holy crap, this is really hard. How do you do it so well? The answer is just like, I have years upon years of practice, both working for an established company like Shopify, that won in the early days, and also just building a startup and not quitting over 5 or 6 years. So the it really is something that you learn over time, and underestimating skills in your first full-time job, if your interest is in building entrepreneurship, is, I think, flawed. So in summary, it's like, build financial runway for yourself. um, if you can, and you're focused and disciplined, build it over evenings and weekends. If not, quit full time and get serious about it. And then lastly, use your full time job as a way to learn transferable skills, ideally learning to code or learning to sell. And then, I think just build stuff. Like, you don't need to wait to start a company or to have the perfect idea. Like what you're doing, James, is awesome. Start stuff, learn through the process of building it what it takes. And I think that will become addicting. And through that, you'll see lots of opportunities to build more interesting companies.
Yeah, I really want to dive into those skills of either learning how to sell stuff or learning how to code stuff, because that's ultimately how you get a company off the ground in the early stages. Imagine these sales skills you developed from your internship at Cisco and Shopify, that must have helped you with, pitching to investors, among a number of other things. So, what was your experience like pitching to investors? And was, public speaking something that always came natural to you, or did you really have to work at it? And did your sales experience come into play here?
Of course, I think basically, of course, sales skills came into pitching investors. Um, we had no idea how to raise money. We can jump ahead to like the YC stuff, but like, sales skills have paid off in virtually every aspect of my role. Um, I think that it is entirely, you know, uh, learnable as a skill. Some of the best public speakers are people who have put themselves in uncomfortable positions where they've had to learn it day in and day out. I've done probably thousands of sales calls, where I'm having to pitch and put myself in an uncomfortable position and ask pretty hard hitting questions. And developing the confidence to do that is, just, it's learned over time. And so Shopify was an incredible experience for me to learn that on the fly. You don't have to take a sales job to learn sales, but you do have to practice it. So whether that's joining a club that enables you to get better at sales, starting a side project and just committing to learning it on the fly, doing maybe a formal sales program. There's lots of different entry points, but you can't just read about it in books. You actually have to go do it.
At some point, I wanted to talk about your YC experience. Why did you end up applying to YC? And maybe provide us with some insight on what your experience was like with YC. So anything from the application process all the way to your experience with the startup school.
Yeah, awesome. YC. So we started the company like December 2017, and we grinded the first year, uh, fully bootstrapped. We started writing code for the product after we left Shopify. We started pitching customers, and we actually had a small amount of revenue where we could effectively pay our modest rents, um, in that first year, which was pretty cool. It was a grind, but like, we got there, and it sort of felt like we could bootstrap this business and it could be a lifestyle business, or we could really go for it. We wanted to go for it. So we but with that, came certain conditions, fundraising, access to investors, access to large customers, and being first time founders. We had no idea how to do any of that stuff. But I had read a lot of Paul Graham's essays while a student at Queen's. So Paul Graham, for those of you who don't know, is one of the founders of Y-Combinator. His personal blog, paulgraham.com, has just an incredible amount of wisdom. Like I've, I would recommend students of any age go in there and just read and try to really absorb the wisdom. It's timeless. And in actually first year at Queen's, a friend of mine sent me an essay called Hiring is Obsolete. And it was effectively a long form essay written by Paul Graham. It's still on his website that talks about how hiring and recruiting for other companies is obsolete relative to the experience you get of starting a company. And that you should start a company because you'll basically be more valuable to future employers, anyways, with the skills you learn. And it might work. And if so, it could be life changing. So I just like read everything possible why that Paul Graham and YC put out. Like I watched all of the startup school videos back that they released back in like 2015 or 2016, something like that. So I'd already been so familiar with YC and so bought in. It was like a secondary source of education for me. And so now that I had my own startup, I was full time on it. We had a little bit of revenue. Things weren't really working per se, but like the product was buggy and our customers tolerated it a lot. But like we were now in the running, right? Like we were in the race to build a startup. So without any knowledge of how to pitch investors, YC's value prop is basically like, we're going to grow your company over 3 months. If you grow and you're successful, we will help you put together a seed round. That seed round will allow you to continue surviving for a period of time. And through the learnings you get through YC, through the network of YC, through the seed round, through the investor relationships you build, and all of the good habits and hygiene, you have a better likelihood of success than if you don't go through YC. That value proposition just sounded very good to us. So we applied in October of 2018. We'd reached out to several YC alumni to have them review our application. We then got an invitation to do an interview for the next week. So we had a week to prepare. We were very excited, very nervous. And the thing about YC's interview process is it's a 10-minute interview, right? So they come in swinging. It's 10 minutes of rapid fire questions. They will cut you off and you have to be super dialed in. There are certain rules as well that you need to follow. Like, for instance, you can never cut off your co-founder. That just looks like you're misaligned as a founding team and you have bad chemistry. One person answers each question, so no one can double up on a question. And your answers need to be incredibly concise. And so through the practice of doing maybe a dozen mock interviews with real YC alum, we felt ready. The number one piece of advice that people gave us about the interview process, though, was to have 3 to 5 bullet points, and each bullet point represents an incredibly powerful reason for why YC should accept you. So those points could be things like something about the founding team that's relevant about the domain. For us, for Roger and I, it was that we worked at Shopify and had led some good results there. We really understood the domain. Market size, revenue growth, sort of insights about the business. Those could be, a bullet point of your 3 to 5. So we wrote down those 3 to 5 bullet points, and then we went into the YC interview, and it was a lot of fun. It was a very intense experience. And so sitting across from us in the interview was Michael Seibel, who runs the YC Accelerator, and he's actually our kind of appointed board member to this day, which is cool. We get to work with him pretty closely. This guy, Kevin Hale, who started a company that sold to SurveyMonkey called Wufoo, and Kat Mignolic, who was the chief of staff to Alexis Ohanian, the founder of Reddit. So you have these like three incredibly successful YC partners staring you down. You shake hands, you sit down, and then they will always ask this first question, or at least this was true when we went through the process. What are you working on? And your goal is to answer that question. What are you working on in a single sentence? Super concise, avoid jargon, just answer it in as plain language as possible. Now, us thinking we could kind of hack the system, we answered that question and then immediately tried to stuff our answer with as many of those 3 to 5 bullet points as possible. So we're like, here's what we do. Our market size is X. Here's how we met. We worked at Shopify, we're working on a similar domain, blah, blah, blah. Michael Seibel cuts me off from answering. So 10 seconds into the interview, he cuts me off and he's like, sorry, wait, what do you guys do? I don't get it. And we just had this like experience of being like, okay, he knows that we're trying to hack the interview process right now and is trying to dismantle us from doing that. Our plan went out the window and we basically had to start over and answer the questions being completely flustered and do so in as best we could to be as fewer words relative to substance. And so we left the interview feeling pretty defeated. I'll never forget though, YC, if you get into the program, they'll call you that night. You just get a phone call from a random number saying, congrats, you got in. If you are rejected, they'll send you an email with a little bit of feedback. And Roger and I had gone for dinner. We're walking up and down this street in Mountain View. We'd flew all the way there the day before, stayed at this like super cheap, crappy Airbnb that we like could barely afford. And even then it was, it was an experience. And we just felt like we utterly failed this interview. And we're nervously waiting for an email or a call. And so I have my phone on loud and I hear my phone basically ding. And I look at my phone and it's an email.
Oh no.
And I say to Roger, Roger, I'm so sorry. Looks like we got rejected. And he's like, well, what does the email say? So I'm like, oh, okay, already very disappointed and sad. I click on the email and it's Kevin, Kevin Hale from YC. And he says, hey, Chris, I couldn't find you on Skype. Can you give me a call at this number? And I'm like, wait, Roger, Kevin wants us to call him. So we call him, put him on speakerphone. Kevin answers. He's like, hey, guys. We're like, hey, Kevin. He's like, so I know that interview felt like it didn't go well, but regardless, we'd like to offer you a spot in YC. And that changed our lives. So it's an entertaining story to tell. There's some more details that I could share, but the experience of YC itself after that call really began, and we moved to Mountain View, California for 3 months and participated in the program. And every single week, it was just doing what we could to grow the company, 10% week over week. And yeah, I'll never forget it. It was an amazing experience.
That's an amazing story, Chris. Wow. I know we're nearly over time, or we already are over time here, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. But a final question I've been asking some of my guests. A lot of our listeners are university students who are kind of in that stage of figuring out what they want to do after university. And I'm curious, what advice do you have for maybe someone who's in university or about to finish with an interest in entrepreneurship and they're not really sure where to start?
Yeah. And I mean, if people aren't sure about where to start, but they're skeptical of the traditional commerce career paths, I would say try different things. Don't get carried away with the Queen's Commerce recruiting paths just because you feel like you need to. Um, there will always be opportunities. The second thing I would say is learn how to write a really good cold email that provides value for the recipient. So many of the angel investors we recruited later on at Convictional, um, you know, jobs that I um, received both at Shopify, Cisco, um, candidates I've hired as a founder have started with a cold email. And it is just an underappreciated tool. And the reason people don't use it is they make sort of these excuses. What if they reject me? What if they don't respond? I don't have anything to value for this person. They're so busy, they're not going to read it anyways. I don't have their contact info. Like all of those questions live inside your head and just represent insecurities that may or may not be true. So, what's the worst that could happen? The person says, don't ever email me again. Well, first of all, most people are probably not going to be mean. Most people, actually, if the cold email is ineffective, would just not respond. So the world doesn't end. You could follow up. You could try a different person. You get the idea. But so much luck is unlocked through cold emailing. The last and final piece of advice I would give you is to don't wait for the perfect idea, just build. Convictional was not the perfect idea. And yet the product we built was iterated over time by learning what customers actually want and adapting to their feedback. We did not have all the answers, nowhere close to when we first started. I've made every mistake in the book in running and building a company, but we are formidable. We learn through experience, and we've been able to amass at least a little tiny bit of success by staying the course, learning from customers, and iterating to their feedback. So that's what I would say. I'd say try lots of things and don't get tempted by recruitment opportunities if they're not exciting to you. I would say focus on learning how to hone the value of cold email and use it liberally, and then don't wait for the perfect idea. Just get started. That's my advice for you, James.
That's some pretty good advice there, Chris. Thank you once again for chatting with me today. I know your insights will be very inspiring for many students contemplating, life after university and what to do with their lives. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time, Chris.
For sure, man. Thanks for having me on.